Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime and psychological cases, as well as a little bit of fashion and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. And today I'm back with a case called the Death Valley Germans, which it's a bit of a weird one to class it as solved or unsolved. I feel like people are going to have quite strong opinions on it because, well, you'll kind of see at the end. I don't really want to spoil it. It's just been a very long-winded case. It occurred in the late 90s, and in more recent years there have been later developments, and none of the questions that there were in the initial investigation have really been answered. But I suppose in some cases, well, in some senses, there are some answers. So it probably makes absolutely no sense to you right now. But yeah, if you want to hear about the case of the Death Valley Germans, basically a family who go on holiday to America and disappear, then keep on watching. But just very quickly before we do get started, I just want to add in my usual little disclaimer that I like to include at the start of the videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through my own research on the internet. So just bear in mind that I only have access to certain sources. I'm not directly linked to any of these cases, and I apologise if I get anything wrong, mispronounce anything like that. I'm not trying to do anyone any harm or an injustice. I'm simply working with any of the information that I have available to me. So with all that being said, we shall just go ahead and start the discussion of the Death Valley Germans. So the Death Valley Germans is the name created by the media given to this particular mysterious case. In July of 1996, a family of four decided to travel from their home in Dresden, Germany to visit the United States. The family consisted of Egbert Rimkus, who was 34 years old, and his son George Weber, who was 11, Egbert's partner Cornelia Meyer, who was 28, and her son Max, who was 4. On July the 8th of that year, the family had flown from Frankfurt into Seattle before catching another flight over to their first destination, which was Los Angeles. After arriving in LA, they picked up their rental van, of which Egbert had initially supposed to be the driver for the trip. But upon the collection of the van, he realised that he couldn't find his driver's licence, and so instead, Cornelia ended up being filed on the system as the driver of the rental van. They had rented the van with the required return date being the July the 26th of that year, the day before their return flight home was due to arrive back in Germany. They spent around a week in the area, more specifically in something called San Clemente, I apologise if I mispronounced that, in the southern region of California, and they spent much of their time sightseeing. They'd stayed here for a short while before heading out to their next stop on their travels, which was Las Vegas. The group had stayed in something called the Treasure Island Hotel in Las Vegas, and while here it's known that Egbert had actually contacted his ex-wife and the mother of his son, a woman named Heike Weber. He had asked her for some money to be sent over to him while the family were on their travels, but records show that this money had never been sent to him. And then on July 22nd, the family checked out of that hotel that they had been staying in and continued on with their journey. They decided to change up what they'd been doing on their holiday up until that point, and they headed to Death Valley National Park on the border of California and Nevada. As the name suggests, Death Valley is a national park that boasts an impressive environmental display with areas of like sand dunes, salt flats, mountains, valleys, canyons, more. It's a very, very vast and kind of intimidating but very impressive national park. Its impressive size makes it the largest national park in the United States, and because of its aggressive desert climate, it's also the driest and the hottest in the US. When the family had arrived at Death Valley, they first headed to the Furnace Creek Visitor Center to grab themselves any information they might need regarding the area and what's available for them to visit, and they grabbed themselves an information booklet with everything they could need, likely containing like a map and things, just to start them off and navigating their way. For their first night in the national park, they headed towards Telescope Peak. This is the highest point in Death Valley National Park, and the view from the top looks over hundreds of miles in every single direction. On their way, driving their 1996 Plymouth Voyager van towards the peak, they found a canyon that seemed like the perfect area for them to set up their campsite for their first night's stay. The details of the family's travels the following day are particularly hazy, but records collected from each of the visitors' centres and visitors' logs at a number of different sites around the national park had shown that the family had all signed their names at a number of the known kind of visitors' points around the area during the following day. And then came July 27th of 1996, when the family had had flights booked back to Germany. However, none of the four were on board the flight. Egbert's ex-wife had become immediately concerned when he and their son had not returned home when they were supposed to, and she straight away attempted to contact them in person just in hopes of finding out exactly where they were. In all likelihood, she'd been hopeful that either they'd missed their flight and they were planning on getting on another one, or they decided to extend their holiday maybe without telling her first. However, neither of these were the case. She had managed to get into contact with the German travel agency that had booked the family's holiday to the United States, and they in turn contacted the rental car company in Los Angeles to inquire whether the van that they know they had rented had been returned, and as it turns out, it hadn't been. And when this travel agency then couldn't themselves contact the family, they decided to report the family as missing abroad to Interpol. And then came the morning of October 21st, 1996. A man named Dave Brenner, who worked as a Death Valley National Park ranger, was part of a crew on a military helicopter carrying out a routine surveillance trip around the southern area of Death Valley. They had more recently been carrying out these aerial searches of the area with the focus of locating drug manufacturing warehouses that were allegedly operating somewhere in the area. While above something called Anvil Canyon, he had spotted something particularly unusual for the area: a van nearly 2.5 miles downstream from Willow Spring, another mapped location in the area. To him, it had been a strange sighting for a number of reasons, namely because there wasn't actually an official or accessible path down to Anvil Canyon. Years before, there had been access for miners to form a route towards Butte Valley, but this route was long gone. Any remainders of the route was declared as an official wilderness area in 1994, meaning that it needed official protection and no vehicle was allowed access. It also seemed clear to Brenner that the form of van he'd spotted would have had great difficulty in actually travelling to the area of the canyon in which it was found. It was a route that only realistically could be navigated by a four-wheel drive with a driver that was particularly familiar with the area. Because of this sighting, they decided to land their helicopter nearby and take a closer look. It was, in fact, a green 1996 Plymouth Voyager van with California license plate. The immediate appearance of the van had given them the impression that it had been in that particular spot for a significant portion of time. It looked as though the van was firmly stuck in the sandy ground, with 3 of the tyres being completely flat. As they looked for tracks heading up to that spot, they were able to determine that the car had travelled for a brief while with the back 2 tyres completely flat. They tried the doors of the van, but it was locked and there was no one around for miles. And so they took note of the license plate number and headed back to their headquarters where they could inquire further. The California Highway Patrol had managed to successfully run a search of the van's number plate and responded to them saying that the van had been reported missing by the LA Police Department on the 10th of September that year, and it was owned by a rental car company. The records had showed that the van had been hired by a family of German tourists on July the 8th, and they had not returned it on the required date in LA in the end of July. The rental company's policy states that the individuals had a further 30 days to return or locate the car before it's then reported as missing to the police. And when the names of the 4 tourists were searched, they came across an Interpol alert reporting them as missing abroad. The following day, on October 22nd, an investigator named Eric Inman was brought in and taken to the site where the car was found. His first step was to photograph everything and carry out a thorough search of the van and the surrounding areas. No visible footprints were found in the surrounding area aside from those of Dave Brenner, who had discovered the van the previous day. The only other things found around the car were the odd bits of food wrappers, toilet paper and some excrement. He was at the site for around an hour before heading to a place called Badwater Road, another area in Death Valley, to meet a few members of the local sheriff's department. After explaining the situation, the sheriff's team decided to head to the site themselves with this investigator. And while they were here, Inman began to search the inside of the car with the permission of the sheriff's department, and they began a thorough search of its contents. There were a number of things found inside the van, including suitcases and clothes, a Praktica 35mm camera with a number of rolls of film, a tent, multiple empty large water bottle containers, an empty and an almost full bottle of bourbon, 2 unopened bottles of Bud Ice beer and 1 empty one, a card carrier with numerous cards belonging to Egbert, a pipe filled with tobacco, toys and other miscellaneous objects. One particular item of interest found inside the van had been a flag with Butte Valley Stone Cabin printed on it. This cabin was in fact part of Death Valley, and it was often referred to as the geologist's cabin. It's located in Butt Valley, just over 4 miles away from where the van was found. Inside the cabin there is usually a decent amount of stocked food, and it's located opposite Anvil Spring, which acts as a particularly good source of water. The cabin could provide someone with a decent form of shelter for a short while, and upon inquiry they discovered that the flag had actually been inside the cabin, so they'd obviously taken it back to the van from the cabin, meaning that in all likelihood the family had been there at some point before returning to their car. Once the site was thoroughly searched, the Sheriff's Department authorised the removal of the van from the canyon the following day and to store it in a nearby impound lot. Investigators had decided to search through the visitor logbooks to see whether they could begin piecing together kind of a journey that the family may have taken while they were in Death Valley. While searching through the logbook collected from the Warm Spring mine site, they found an entry that had been written in by the family. It had read 7/23/96, Connie, Egbert, George and Max, and then underneath it, written in German, it read, "We are going over the pass." The only logical pass that they could have been referring to, according to the rangers, had been Mengel Pass, which was just a few miles away from where the van was found in Anvil Canyon. This pass is an extremely difficult and rocky ride, and it's one that only an experienced four-wheel driver would have been able to navigate, so much so that it would have been near impossible for them to have successfully travelled it in the van that they had been driving. They'd also established there had been a gap in the timeline initially of the family's journey, following when they had arrived at the visitor centre on July the 22nd, and then them signing the logbook the following day. And at this same time, the first group of search parties had set out to begin the hunt for the family. Some of the individuals from the China Lake Mountain Rescue Group had discovered a Bud Ice beer bottle stood firmly in sand around 1.7 miles downstream from the location of the van, one that actually matched the ones found inside the van when it had been searched. They had also noted that there was a large print in the ground next to where the bottle had been stood, giving them the impression that someone at some point had used this as a place to sit. Aside from this, none of the teams that had set out in hopes of searching the area had found anything else on this day. And then the following day, on October 24th, more teams of search parties joined to aid the search of the area. This meant that they were able to search a much larger portion of Death Valley in a much quicker time, as well as being aided at this point by 2 helicopters. And the search grew even more the following 2 days, but still nothing new had been discovered. And over the years, more professional search teams have been sent out in search of the area in hopes of someone at some point being able to uncover something that could give them some indication of what had happened to the family. A man named Emmett Harder was granted access to the rolls of film found inside the van and was able to identify that one of the pictures that the family had taken on the camera had been a sunset looking over the main valley in an easterly facing direction. This meant that the photo had been taken in something called Hanapaw Canyon, around 17 miles north of Warm Spring Canyon, where the cabin had been that the family had checked into on July the 23rd. This gave them the strong impression that the family had camped in Hanapaw Canyon the night of July the 22nd before heading to the cabin the following day. One investigator had later noted a potential link in a discovery made in the months after the family's initial disappearance. A ranger carrying out his routine search of the area around 18 miles south of the van had found an abandoned sleeping bag on an abandoned dirt road. At this point, the van had not been discovered, and so the connection couldn't have been made at the time, but in retrospect, investigators could confirm that there was in fact one sleeping bag missing from the van when they'd initially searched it. And so this couldn't really be confirmed, but it seems like there is a likely connection there. And because at this point, all these years later, there remains little to no clues as to what happened to the family, all that can be done is to kind of develop scenarios, potential theories as to what possibly happened to them. So it seemed as though the most popularly argued theory, as it is with many cases involving family disappearances, was that the 4 had decided to stage their own disappearance in order to up and start a new life somewhere. This was seemingly supported by the fact that investigators had later become aware of the difficulties Egbert and his ex-wife were having in regards to their custody agreement. A number of his co-workers in Germany had also come forward and said that they'd all heard Egbert talking about upping his life and moving specifically to Costa Rica on multiple occasions. However, it has been argued that the way in which they went about staging a disappearance, if this was the case, it was particularly unusual. There would likely be much safer ways of going about it. As I said, many of the locations in which parts of this case had occurred were particularly dangerous to navigate and difficult if you weren't driving a four-wheel drive, which obviously they weren't. And so it would have seemed like a much more realistic and just as effective method if they had just done so elsewhere, perhaps in the US or perhaps in Germany. It's also known that Cornelia's work life in Germany was in fact extremely successful, another reason that it makes it kind of quite unlikely that they would just suddenly up and leave. And the majority of other theories kind of take the form that there is something more sinister and criminal involved. These can stem from virtually any scenario. One in particular I came across online was some people had suggested the possibility of a group of individuals that were identified as Charles Manson followers had come from Barker Ranch, not an impossible distance away. It is also entirely possible for there to be a scenario that featured the family falling victim to someone else. However, it is a rather unlikely scenario considering the location in which it all took place. There are a number of questions that come about after researching this case. Namely, I've seen a lot of people sharing the opinion that both Cornelia and Egbert were particularly reckless throughout their travels. There was evidence to suggest that they hadn't had enough money to last them their entire trip, as there had been multiple attempts for them to get extra money sent over to them partway through their journey. People have also pointed out the weather records for summer in that area and have claimed it was entirely optimistic or possibly careless for them to visit Death Valley in an unsuitable vehicle in the hottest month of the year, and their believed attempts to take a number of difficult off-road pathways while in Death Valley when it wasn't a familiar area for them is also unusual behaviour, as well as, like I said, doing so in the van that they had been driving. Investigators had also said that from what they found inside the van, it seemed as though there had been nowhere near enough equipment or supplies for them to last if they had been delayed for even a short while they were in Death Valley, let alone if they were to break down or get stranded completely somewhere. Little came about in terms of the case until some years later in 2009. On the 12th of November of that year, a pair of hikers had discovered human remains in something called Gola Wash, around a 2-hour journey south of where the minivan had been found in Anvil Canyon. The skeletal remains had been scattered, and not far from them was a wallet full of ID cards belonging to Cornelia Mayer. Around the area they'd found a toothbrush with what they believed to be toothpaste, a small shoe believed to have either belonged to a woman or a child, pages from Cornelia's daily planner that she carried on her, and business cards from places the family has visited while they were on their holiday. A further search led to the discovery of a 2-litre wine bottle and a bottle slightly downstream, later confirmed to have matched one of the Bud Ice bottles found inside the abandoned van. And by that point, the only signs of an identity was that of Cornelia and none of the other family members. In order for the family to have arrived in this location from when their van was abandoned, they would have had a difficult walk of about 8 or 9 miles in the blistering heat, in shoes that clearly were not made for hiking. They were not suitable for the weather conditions. By March of 2010, the local sheriff's office had still been unsuccessful in identifying the remains found, likely due to the extreme weather exposure that they had been put through during the years. It's concluded that the forensic evidence points towards there being bones of one adult male and one adult female. There is a fantastic write-up that I'll actually link in the description below that goes into great detail about how they began to piece together the route that they believed the family had taken from Anvil Canyon. It's really long, but definitely worthwhile read if you want to see the whole process of them trying to piece together a journey. While on the search for the potential route, the investigators came across a wooden post with red paint covering the top, stood in soil surrounded by rocks. A beer bottle was left perched on top, and the purpose of this wasn't known. It was just a strange sighting that they'd come across. And then in May of 2010, a set of DNA could finally be collected from some of the remains found, and there had been a very high likelihood of a match to Egbert. In December of 2010, it was reported that in another area, some children's shoes and some small bones were also discovered. These remains, and the remains that were believed to have belonged to an adult woman, were sent for further DNA testing in hopes of providing an identity. And as of this current point, or as of my research, I wasn't able to find any further updates on whether any form of DNA had been successful, and whether they'd been able to find some kind of identity, whether they were human or not. I couldn't really find any updates, so let me know if you do have some sources that maybe provide a little bit more of an insight into the more recent investigation, because I'd definitely love to know. But yeah, that is everything that I have to share with you. I hope you guys kind of understand now why it's kind of a difficult one, like I said in the intro, to say whether it's solved or unsolved, because it definitely is unsolved, but there's a partial discovery of believed remains, but even then we don't know if those remains do belong to the missing family. So that is everything I'm going to discuss today. I just want to say my heart does go out to this family and their family members as well, everyone that loved them and knew them. It's really awful to go through something like that. I can't even imagine an entire family just going missing. It's absolutely awful, and I do hope one day that there are some answers that do come about in relation to even just providing an identity. So let me know your guys' thoughts down below on what you think happened while they were in Death Valley. You know, maybe why they would have left their van, whether they'd gotten stuck. I don't know, there's so many potential theories, so let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.